Hello and welcome back to the Scale Modelling Cafe, and welcome to the episode that I think a lot of people have been waiting for. This is the construction episode of the Kinetic Sea Harrier FRS.1. It all started with the front nose wheel bay. Not badly detailed, but there's quite a lot of sort of pins and ejector pin marks and things like that which are visible. But actually it's quite deep and it's quite buried up there, so I didn't fix too much. I added a few bits of plastic card to hide things here and there, but yeah, it's sort of painted up nicely, a little bit of an oil wash to make things pop, and that's just cemented together. This is the aftermarket 3D printed fan, and it's an absolute beauty. So that was painted with alclad steel and just popped in with super glue. Now that sort of shroud thing around, you can see I've painted it white, and it should be extra dark sea grey, but I end up fixing that later. Backed up with just a bit of super glue on the outside, and that's actually quite a sturdy bit of construction. So this nose wheel bay just locates into the front of it, and again the fit is actually quite nice. And that gives an idea of what eventually you might be able to see down the intakes. One of these blue clamps, absolute godsend on this project. And you can see there it's holding the resin cockpit, so feel free to pop over and watch episode 2 on how I painted that. I had to remove an awful lot of material to get that thing to fit. Offering up now the intake part, and you can see there, you think, oh yeah, the fit's not too bad at all actually. But actually the front fuselage is warped, and you'll see later some big gaps. Everything's in. It was all backed up with 5-minute epoxy, including the cockpit. The air brake bay, and this is a resin replacement. You can see the difference in detail there. Once removed from the casting block, that can be glued in place, and the fit was actually fairly good at the rear, not so good at the front. Popping in the main undercarriage bay, that fit okay. You see that's been painted and weathered, but not much of that is going to be seen because the main gear doors are closed on this aeroplane. Mountings for the nozzles, they were removed later because they interfered with the aftermarket replacement parts. And now time to put the fuselage together. So my usual method of super glue. This is the black super glue from Ammo of MiG, and I just spread it on the parts, hold it together, and you do actually get a reasonable amount of working time actually. You might be able to see the splay in the front there, that horrible warpage. But you know, the glue will take care of that. That'll clamp together okay. Just going in with a bit of accelerator once I'm happy that it's all aligned, and that'll flash off quite quickly. Still give it a bit of a squeeze. You can still move it a few seconds after you've put it in. The fin has been done. Now the debris at the back. Just using a knife blade to put the glue in. It's quite a precise applicator, an old knife blade. And again, that can just be squeezed together and then the accelerator applied. And you can actually spread the glue around and spread it over the seam. And that will help eliminate any sort of seam issues. Quick rub down with the sanding sticks. and polishing back up, just removing some of the scratches. You can see there I'm using it wet. That's going to help eliminate the scratches as well. And as you can see there, 90 degrees to the seam, and again that's going to help eliminate some of the scratches. Just drying it off, testing it with a finger. Now, I mentioned the horrible gap, so when it was all clamped together, this gap appeared. So it was filled with some plastic card, a bit of a shim, and then over the top with the super glue, and then that was all rubbed back. But I wasn't happy with how it looked, so it was out with the ubiquitous in this project Mr. Hobby epoxy filler. This stuff is my absolute go-to. It's amazing stuff. Doesn't shrink, sand scribes exactly like plastic. It's just perfect. And yeah, this was a bit of a mistake. Massive gaps all the way around, so I ended up filling them. But actually it's designed to be like that, although for some reason it's got the cutout included, which confused me, because I didn't think there was supposed to be a gap where the sort of cutout was, but there was. So that was filled. Just restoring some of that detail. Bit of a complicated rescribing job that. It looks quite simple actually on the face of it, but there's some small squares in there, and those sort of lines are actually quite close together. Just hitting it with a bit of extra thin, just to melt away some of the excess. More filler, and this is where the air brake goes. Now there's a bit of an asymmetric gap here at the front, so I filled that with a bit of plastic card. You might see a bit of red on the rear bit of filler. Yep, that is blood. So literally blood, sweat and tears went into this model. And these are a worthy replacement for the old Flory model sanding sticks, those ones from Ammo. There's an awful lot of sanding going on here. And yep, I did fill over the chaff dispensers because the FRS.1 didn't have chaff dispensers right at the beginning of its career. Restoring the panel line details now with Dymo tape and the old trumpeter scriber, which actually I really like. It's really quite sharp and very fine. I'm a big fan of that. More rescribing going on. This is the sort of square panel that is on the back. Different technique, template and a needle in a pin vise. That'll just get a bit of a rub down, get rid of the burrs. And even though it's resin, the glue will tidy things up. Now to restore all the panel lines on the lower fuselage seam. So a mix of technique, using Dymo tape, freehand with the razor saw, and I even get out the template again a bit later. So once all the scribing's done, it's out with the sanding stick, and it can all have a bit of a rub down. Here's the aforementioned template, and the needle in the pin vise again. Don't be afraid to go over a seam with super glue in it. It's very narrow and it doesn't affect the scriber at all. So that whole underside was completely rescribed. The detail there is actually quite shallow, so it's very easy to damage it all. Same on the rear end as well. that had a full rescribing job. Quite complicated, this area around the back actually, as you can see. Just the glue will help melt away the excess, smooth everything out. Makes it look like part of the kit actually. Right, the intakes. So you can see how proud they sit in the sort of middle bit at the radius, and massive gaps there at the join with the fuselage. Note also that the blow-in doors are incorrect. I've glued them the wrong way round. They actually hinge from the front. More of that later. Deluxe Perfect Plastic Putty was the filler of choice on the inside. It's water-based, so that just is easily cleaned up with a wet cotton bud. And then the whole rest of the intake was slathered in the Mr. Hobby epoxy. It was all sanded down, which was a mammoth session, and then obviously all the details got to be restored again. An old toothbrush there, just going in to clean out the panel lines after the sanding, and then in with the glue again just to melt things away. And that was actually a really neat job. I was really pleased with how that turned out. This was a raised panel underneath, so it was all sanded away, and then using my portrait cutter I just put a replacement with vinyl, and it worked really well actually. Double layered, so the top one is slightly smaller than the bottom one, so it's quite important to get everything lined up, and that can just be burnished down with the finger, and it won't lift off or anything, and eventually it'll get sealed in under primer. Right, wing to fuselage now. Again, another epic. So the fuselage bits here at the wing root, they were too shallow. There was a big step underneath and a big gap as well. So it was shimmed with thin plastic card. This is probably, it's either 5 or 10 thou. I don't know which, if I'm honest. And a spreader bar there at the front to deal with the gaps. When dry, the plastic card can just be trimmed with a scalpel. So that's going to address the depth issue. And this is going to be an awful lot easier than gluing the wings in and then using filler. That just gets tidied up with a sanding stick and then feathered in at the back end, because that is actually quite a sharp edge. I've still got a few flory sanding sticks left, and it came into its own in this for this job. And there's a dry fit. Most of the gaps eliminated. Step is pretty much gone. Now let's have a look at the dry fit on the top end. Yeah, not great. It kind of sits proud at the front, and there's that massive gap. But I did trim a little bit to get rid of the step. And we can go with some Tamiya white cap glue. Really strong bond with this stuff actually. I'm a big fan. Doesn't go stringy like a lot of other glues like that. Now this was quite springy, it kept on springing up. So it's out with the blue clamps again in a second, but just backing it up with the liquid cement. That will just flood the gap and help to seal it. Just making sure that I'm holding the pressure down and then coming with the blue clamp, and I'm going to put it across the join, and then they'll just squeeze that down and just hold it in place, so I'm not going to get any steps or anything. and then just repeating the process at the front. All the time holding the pressure down, because what I don't want to do is get any sort of molten plastic oozing out at all. Once the clamp's on, I can just back it in with a bit of glue again, and this is going to help just seal everything in. Almost got the underside of the wing roots. And very awkward at the front of the wing roots. There is a little bit of a gap, a step, a seam, flash. It's going to take sorting out, but it was relatively straightforward to do with a little bit of plastic putty, perfect plastic putty from Deluxe, and a bit of sanding. You might see that later. And we'll leave that overnight to dry. Filler was required, so the Mr. Hobby epoxy was slathered on over all the joins, and again another mammoth sanding session ensued. Now it's important not to sand too hard with too much pressure, otherwise you will get a dip. Quite a tight join here, and the sanding stick, and I did try a bit of wet and dry to get in there, but it didn't work, so scalpel blade was ideal for that. And then repeated at the front, but you can see the perfect plastic putty there just on the shoulder bits and underneath, so that was actually cut down, that sanding stick. More filler on the wing tips, had to remove a bit of plastic for the wings to fit in the first place, and then there was a bit of a gap, so that needed filler as well. And then onto a mammoth scribing session. So thin strips of Dymo tape are really useful over curved surfaces. Mixture of the scribing tool, very fine razor saw, every sort of tip and trick in the book I could muster. A bit of freehand along some existing panel lines that had faded out because of the sanding, and the saw's quite a good way of getting a nice straight line actually. You've got to be careful though, and we can just bat that in with the scriber so it all matches. I mentioned I got the colour wrong, and I mentioned I got the intake doors wrong, so the intakes were ripped off, and that gave me the opportunity to go in and respray everything actually, so it was a bit of a happy accident I did that. The fan blade was masked. I managed to prise these off and switch round the blow-in doors, as you can see, but it did create more gaps and things, so it was out with the filler again after this, and everything was completely rescribed all over again. See a bit of masking tape there and a bit of paint, just sort of easier to do it as I went along. Some of the masking, it will help later on. Big gap at the top with the rudder, that won't do, so that had a plastic card shim and that was all sanded to size. Ailerons were a real pain. These actuators don't really work because there's a step, so they had to be cut in half, as you can see, and only holes exist on the flap itself. Nose cone didn't really fit particularly well, so that had the lip cut off. Everything sanded flush, and this ended up just being a butt joint in the end. I did add a bit of weight in the nose cone just in case. I didn't think I needed it. and that improved the fit a lot. Gun pods are woefully inaccurate really. All the cooling holes were drilled out, the muzzle was drilled out, strakes added, and then once they were done, these could be just glued in place. Actually, the fit to the fuselage, to be fair, was very good. The locating sort of guides are really very vague, and the instructions were pretty useless. In fact, they're pretty useless all the way through the build. And yeah, out with the clamps just to make sure I didn't get any gaps. This is the mount for the pitot probe, so the pitot was cut off, drilled out. That needed fillet as well. Tailplane join was really small and fragile, so that was drilled and pinned. This is absolutely vital because they are going to get broken off otherwise. Photo etch wing fences, which kept on falling off. Luckily, I kept on finding them and sticking them back on, but that was really frustrating. Okay, let's check everything with primer. And you can see actually at the end of it all, it really looks quite neat and tidy. You can see I've added the combing there for the cockpit, and that's gone in. Windscreen, big gaps around the front. So again, out with the perfect plastic putty, cleaned up with water and a cotton bud. We're almost there. I decided to use these rare earth magnets for the first time for the ordnance and the pylons. They worked an absolute treat actually. Really pleased with that. And I was even clever enough to get the plus and minuses sorted so you couldn't put the wrong ones on the wrong wing. And there we are. An absolute epic build, full of filler, sanding, scribing, frustration, and as I said earlier, literally blood, sweat and tears. But it's together and it's ready for primer. So I'll leave you with some higher res pictures. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll finish it off next time. Cheers, bye bye.
Retribution.